So I'm going to be talking about the NISAR soil moisture product. I'm a member of the NISAR science team, and I'm the lead for the soil moisture group. And so my brief outline of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to go over some very broad brush things about the NISAR mission, just for those of you who aren't as familiar with it. And I'll talk about how we get soil moisture, or at least estimates of soil moisture, from synthetic aperture radar data. And on that front, I'll kind of go over how does that work, what kind of expectations we have, what sort of models are we using to retrieve soil moisture, what does the actual product look like, including the structure of the file, and some examples of what some of the early NISAR data is looking like. And I'll go over how we're trying to validate the product and figure out if we're doing a good job, right? So calibration, validation, fields efforts to collect data while NISAR is flying overhead, those sorts of things. And then I'm going to go to a little bit of science, I hope, at the end. So beyond just trying to retrieve soil moisture itself, we can look at how estimates of soil moisture can affect some of the other disciplines that many people in the EarthScope community care about. And so this often involves trying to separate out the effects of motion of the ground surface that people often try to study with NISAR from things like changes in vegetation or from soil moisture. And so I'll show some examples of some of the work we're doing at Cornell on that, as well as what other folks in the community are working on. And just to give you a little bit of a story behind the picture in the back, this is an actual NISAR interferogram with the Finger Lakes, or the kind of black linear features on there. We're right here at Cornell University. And I just want to acknowledge the work of several recent and current graduate students at Cornell who've been really important in trying to get some of the data processed that I'm going to show today. Okay, so NISAR stands for the NASA ISRO Synthetic Aperture Radar Mission. And again, I'm not going to be talking about the rest of the mission all that much today. I'm really focusing on the soil moisture product today. And so there's a really kind of rich team of people who are working on the product itself and generating calibration validation data for the first year or so of the project. A lot of these people have history with other soil moisture missions like the SMAP mission. And I also really want to put out my thanks to the project team members, including Stephen Chan, who worked on the project at its early days, Xiao Dong, and Cecilia, who really have enabled us to get to the point where we are today. So a huge amount of work on their part. And so we, as many of you know, we had a successful launch on July 30th of this past year after many years of waiting for a US India SAR satellite mission. This is just a picture of the launch vehicle in India before launch, and a nice image of some of the JPL science project team members during launch as they were watching it in real time. So this is a very exciting day for us, and everything worked out amazingly well. Leading up to the mission, one of the things I kind of enjoyed was a lot of JPL artists put together these beautiful images of what the satellite would be looking at if you were able to see it from space. This is an image over California showing some nice weather patterns. Again, all of this is an artist's visualization. Here's another one where I feel like NISAR is being rather pensive, looking out at these beautiful features in kind of the East African desert here. And this one, I wasn't able to figure out where this is, but I like this image because it really points out some of the parts of NISAR that required a huge amount of collaboration between NASA and the ISRO. So the two space agencies working together on this incredibly complex mission for the first time. So you had project team members from both space agencies traveling to between the two countries, working together very, very closely on making sure everything was going to work out. And one of the things that's really special about NISAR is that there are two different wavelengths that are being acquired by this platform. So we have an L-band SAR, which is a slightly longer wavelength than we've often been able to use with INSAR data from other satellites. And there's also an S-band SAR. And there are some points in the time during different orbits and things like that, I'll show in a minute, where both of these are going to be acquired. So it's kind of an unprecedented opportunity to look at how different wavelengths see the same surface. So these images were all very nice, but nothing really beats the next one I'm going to show you here. Some of you have probably seen this. This is an actual image of NISAR in orbit that's taken from another satellite about 100 kilometers away. So this was shared by a commercial company that has its own satellites, and they took this beautiful image of NISAR and then shared it a few months later. Okay, so getting to the observation plan, what I'm showing here is this animation that shows 2 weeks of NISAR data acquisitions. So NISAR is a very wide swath, about 240 kilometers wide, and it covers the Earth in these strips because it's in what we call a sun-synchronous orbit, where it's always kind of going around at the same time of day. So it'll cross over the surface at about 6 a.m. and then 6 p.m. on the other side of the Earth. And so it'll do that every time it goes over a point so that every image is always taken at the same time of day, local time of day. So that's very helpful. And the different colors here are showing different modes that the satellite will be acquiring data. And so this adds a little bit of complexity that the community is going to have to get used to. If we look at kind of this plot here is the observation plan that captures all of these different modes. You don't have to kind of figure out every little color that's on this plot. I'm mainly showing this to get across the idea that as you look at one of these tracks, you're going to have the satellite changing mode a little bit over time. So it'll go from higher resolution to lower resolution. It'll change whether it's acquiring S-band and L-band or just L-band. All of those things will change. And so when you're looking at the data, just be aware that these mode changes are likely to occur. And again, this gets revised every 6 months. They've already made some changes post-launch as they figure out which things work better in some areas and things like that. And as I mentioned before, S-band data is not acquired everywhere. These two plots here show the coverage in April of this year, where the two different kind of directions you can see here are from when the satellite is moving towards the north, we call that ascending, and then descending where it's traveling towards the south, it's shown here. And so at any of these little colored frames you see here, we're going to be acquiring L-band and S-band data. So that's going to eventually be very, very useful for some new science that we really haven't had much opportunity to do in the past. So those are some of the main features of the mission itself. One of the things that I think keeps many of us up at night in a good way is the following plot, which is that NISAR is going to be generating just an unprecedented amount of data. This chart here is from the Alaska Satellite Facility, where they're just showing kind of the historic archive of different types of synthetic aperture radar or SAR data. You can see kind of these green bars are progressively getting bigger as data from the various missions that have been up there have come in. The blue bars are NISAR. So it's going to be a huge amount of data coming in. It's already been a large amount of data. So far, just the processing system that has been basically going through the paces and getting tested over the past month or two has pulled in 450 terabytes of data, and it's made 3 petabytes of products. And so I'll get to that question. Sorry, a question came up. I'll get to that later. And so we're going to have to get used as a community to dealing with these very, very large volumes of data. And so all of this is going to be hosted at the Alaska Satellite Facility, which is producing a wide range of tools that people can use to try and, again, subset the data, search through the data, figure out which kind of portion of these large data sets people want to actually download. Okay, so on the science side, what are people doing with this? The original kind of vision of NISAR had these 3 science areas plus applications and disaster response. And that's what's kind of shown here. Solid Earth deformation includes all sorts of things that deform the Earth's surface, earthquakes, volcanoes, landslides, all of those sorts of things. Ecosystem and agriculture was looking at vegetation structure, biomass, wetlands. Cryosphere, obviously looking at glacier motions and mass changes in the ice sheets and glaciers around the world. And then disaster response, looking at change detection after an earthquake or a large flood or a hurricane. All of these things were in the original vision of NISAR. And so soil moisture is an add-on, and I'll talk a little bit more about the history of that as well. Excuse me. And so while some of the other disciplines use INSAR, which is, again, what I think a lot of the EarthScope community is used to seeing, all the pretty rainbow fringes and images like the one on the upper left here. The soil moisture product is going to primarily be relying on the SAR part of INSAR, SAR, not INSAR. And so I'm going to go over a little bit about how that works. So just to remind you, synthetic aperture radar, or SAR, is when the satellite sends out its own energy. So this is an active remote sensing approach. We're not just using reflected energy from the sun. And we record both the intensity and phase of the response back at the satellite. And so some of the energy that goes and hits the ground surface, because of little irregularities on the surface, will get bounced back towards the radar. That's what's shown in pink. But a lot of it's going to be bounced away. And this goes off back into the sky and we never see it again. Right? So what we measure back at the satellite is just the portion that's shown here in pink. And so to first order, the intensity of that return is, or the intensity of the backscatter depends a lot on surface roughness. And so whether you're looking at a rough surface, which will give you a lot of little facets that will reflect energy back towards the surface, that will give you a bright return at that location. A really, really smooth, glassy surface will give you very dark imagery, right? Because most of the energy is going off away from the satellite. And so even without thinking about the phase at all, we can see a lot of variability just in how bright the surface is due to this surface roughness portion. So here's an image that shows that. This is an image over Okmok in Alaska. And you can hopefully very clearly see the volcano here on the island. There's a little airstrip here. You can kind of see right there, that little triangular feature there is an airport, which is very smooth and therefore very dark. And even out in the ocean, you can see, which is this darker area around the island, you can see variations in basically the surface roughness of the water that's causing the brightness to vary as well. And so all of these things can affect what just the raw SAR images look like when we first look at them. But this is not soil moisture, right? This is just basically the geometry of the surface. And so when we think about soil moisture, then we're actually going a different level. If you kind of keep the surface the same, you're not changing its roughness at all in any way, you're going to still see variations in how bright the surface is based on whether or not it's wet. And so if you have a dry soil, you have a low contrast between air and the dielectric constant of the soil, right? So you'll see much of the energy will go into the soil and you'll only have a small return coming back towards the satellite, relatively small. When you have a wet soil, then you have a larger contrast in dielectric properties between the air and the subsurface. So you get a much stronger return going back towards the satellite. So for an active remote sensing approach like what we have with NISAR, you'll see the soils get brighter or darker depending on whether they're wet or dry. Now, the other level of complexity is that, of course, when there's vegetation growing or being cut down, that also changes the surface. And it's something that kind of introduces errors and noise in all of these measurements. So just to show you an example of what this looks like, this is an image. This is a ground-based radar. This is just what you see on the Weather Channel and things like that. So NextRad data for a storm crossing the area near Oklahoma City at one point in time. So the storm in this case is moving towards the east. And the red colors here are where it was raining really hard. And if I look at a SAR image that's taken at exactly the same time, or within 5 minutes, it looks like this. And so this is Sentinel-1 data. This is well before NISAR launched. And you can see this dark band here is right where the storm is. So we can actually see the rain in the air at this point. But we also can see the effect of all of this rain on the surface itself. So if I look at, again, this is the SAR image at the time of the storm. Here's another one before the storm. You can see it's a little darker overall just by looking at it, right? And if I take the difference in that, here I've colored blue as areas that got brighter during the storm event, and red is areas that are darker. So right along the storm front where we have the rain falling through the air and absorbing the microwave energy, it actually is darker there, but everywhere else where the rain has already fallen, it's brighter. And so this is the effect of the wet the wetness of the soil compared with the dry soil beforehand. You can note over here in this corner where the rain hasn't hit yet, you see everything looks pretty much kind of white, red, white, blue, that sort of thing. It's basically zero. And this is where it hasn't started raining yet. So just in this one image, we can see a dry area and a wet area just based on the brightness of that SAR return. And we could do a whole lot else with it as well. This is showing an image in Florida. This is put together by Joseph Kellendorfer, also with Sentinel-1 data, which has been up for more than a decade now. And here what he's done is he's looked at not just one part of the image, but different polarizations of the radar. So we can send out vertically polarized waves and record the vertically polarized return, but we can also record the horizontal polarization of the return signal as well. And those will be different based on kind of the features in the surface, particularly with vegetation. So all of these different colors are showing this is 1 year's worth of data in 2017, how different surface types in agricultural areas or flooded areas will look very, very different to the SAR. So this is kind of an average over 1 year. You can also look at changes just due to things like flooding of vegetated regions. This is just a little cartoon showing how on a normal day, if you've got, say, a tree here, the microwave energy comes in and interacts with branches and leaves and the trunk, and some of it goes back towards the satellite and gets recorded. But if you flood that ground, you get this thing called double bounce, where you have reflections off the plant and the water surface that combine to make a brighter return. And this data from Brazil really shows that well. These areas, this is a river here that you can see kind of in black in the upper left. And as this region gets flooded, you get this bright area, which is vegetation that's now flooded. And excuse me. So looking this over time, you can get a really nice map of where this flooding is actually happening over time. This is just a couple more examples of what you can do with SAR brightness and backscatter on its own, no NISAR in any of these. This is imagery for Hurricane Helene, which affected Florida a couple years ago now. And again, this big kind of bullseye you see here is brightness variations in the water due to the wind patterns on the ocean surface going around and around the eye of the hurricane. And so they can take this data and turn this into a model of wind speeds right near the surface of the water. So that was one product you can make from SAR just from this. And on the right, all of these areas in blue are areas where, in the same way I just showed in Brazil, you can use the change from one SAR image to the next to see just the change in brightness to see where there's been inundation and flooding. All right, so these can be really, really powerful tools when you look right during a hurricane, even when there's still clouds overhead. You can't see this with optical data from Landsat or anything like that. With microwave data, you can actually see through the clouds and tell where there's been flooding, sometimes even when the storm is still going on. And here's again some NISAR data. This is just showing, excuse me, another kind of multicolor composite. In this case, what I've done, instead of different polarizations, I'm using 3 different dates and I've colored them different colors. And so this is from November 1st, 13, and 25th of this year. This is data over kind of the Monterey Bay, Salinas area. And wherever you see something that looks gray, white, or black, all 3 dates basically have the same brightness, right? So you're having the same amount of backscatter on every date. That'll look basically just like somewhere on the gray scale. When one of these dates is brighter than the others, then that color will dominate. And what you can see here is the whole image kind of looks bluish purple. And that's because on November 25th, it rained. And so that particular date is brighter overall than the other dates. And so you can also see a lot of variability out over here in agricultural fields, showing kind of variations in how plants were growing during this time frame as well. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about the product itself. So the reason we have a soil moisture product as part of NISAR came from the Satellite Needs Working Group, which is a group of about around 80 government agencies who get together and they talk about what their needs are. And this basically brought some extra funding to the NISAR project to produce a soil moisture product. And there's all sorts of applications of this that were kind of listed by these groups. Obviously, agriculture cares a lot about what soil moisture is and how it varies over time. But people who are trying to study droughts, the risk of fires or flooding, all of those depend on soil moisture as well. And weather forecasts as well will often, one of their largest uncertainties is the state of soil moisture in a different region. This is the only level 3 product that will be generated operationally by NISAR. There are kind of spot locations where NISAR is making other products for use in calibration validation by other parts of the project, but this is the only one that will be done globally. It is global. It's not going to be generated over permanent ice or water bodies. We're not going to make a soil moisture product over Greenland or urban areas, but it will be made everywhere else. It'll have about a 200-meter resolution over most of the world and about 400 meters in the Sahara. 72-hour latency if everything goes well, and a target accuracy of about 6% in terms of soil moisture. There's also going to be a whole lot of quality flags that are generated as part of the product, but the product will be made even when those quality flags come out as bad, right? So things like, is the area covered by dense vegetation? We're still going to make a soil moisture product there, but there will be a flag telling you, hey, this is a place where you should probably use this with caution. If we can tell that it's raining at the time, if the ground is frozen, all of those things will provide the user with so that they can better assess the product. So this is just an example. This is vegetation water content over the whole world. And one of our flags is that if it's over 5 kilograms per meter cubed, we will flag that as potentially suspect. And so in this case, all of those regions that are shown in red are places where there's so much vegetation that we don't feel that the product is likely to be as accurate. Okay, so just some highlights. Again, so we're going to have a 200-meter aggregated basically the backscatter intensity, which we call sigma naught, that's going to be available in the product as well. So that's the input data. And that's going to be generated at all polarizations, any frequencies, L and S, any data that was taken at that moment in time will get aggregated down to this 200-meter resolution and provided as part of the product. There's other stuff will be in there as well, the local incidence angle, other stuff you might need to interpret the product. And then we're going to have 3 different algorithms that are each producing an independent soil moisture estimate. And so there'll be a top-level product that's right now is planned to just be the mean of those 3 with quality assessment metrics and all of that. But the 3 algorithms themselves are also going to be in there as layers. And we do this because, again, we've never had data like NISAR before. And I think that there's going to be a lot of interesting science done on whether, excuse me, which of these 3 performs the best in different areas. I expect it's very likely that one of them will work better than the others in desert regions, another will work in places where there's a lot of agriculture. We're going to find that out over the next year. And so we decided it was a little bit premature to just pick one now before we could actually see the data. I'm being asked about when this is going to be made available. The current plan is at the end of February, NISAR data will be in selected regions is going to be available to everyone. And hopefully very soon after that, they're going to produce it over the whole world available to everyone. The soil moisture product is, again, going to be available in a few places. And then after we've had enough calibration validation data, which I'm going to talk about next, we'll be able to release it to everyone as well. And so all 3 of these models have very different dependencies on whether or not they need a time series. One of them only uses 1 date at a time. The others require 3 or 4 dates. Some of them require ancillary data like vegetation water content or a weather model. Others don't, right? So they have differences, and over the next 6 months or so, we're going to hopefully be able to assess those. So that'll be what we call the calibration validation phase, where we kind of figure out how these are performing and what is the optimal combo that we should present the user with. All of this data is going to be provided in what's known as hierarchical data format, or HDF5. This will be true across all of NISAR. It takes a little bit of getting used to if you haven't played with it before, but I've come around and I like it a lot. And what it basically is, it's a method to package a whole bunch of different types of layers and metadata and other things into one file. So it's all there in one spot for you as the user to use. And so you can kind of imagine it as like a directory tree. You've got all of these different levels, like you can see here. This is, the really, really long name of a NISAR product, which has a lot of useful information in it, but it's a little unwieldy. You can open up all of these different layers and see all of this other material that's in there. And so things like, what's the latitude and longitude of the file? What's the retrieval quality? What's that top level soil moisture product? The algorithm candidates will have the 3 different layers. And you can go down and look at any of this material you need. So ancillary data, here's, it has land cover, what's the surface quality, are there water bodies there or not? All of that's in this one file, right? So it can be really, really useful once you get used to playing with this. If you work with Linux, there's a really nice thing you can install called H5 Glance that will give you a nice little directory tree that looks like this. You can see what's in the file. And if you're more used to using GDAL or QGIS or other GIS packages, just know that you can use this pretty directly just by adding netcdf with a little colon to that file name. And so there's already quite a few little tutorials that are I think available now, and we're going to continue to push all of this out to the public so that people can pull the layer that they want and bring it into whatever GIS software they want to use. Another nice thing about GDAL, if you have started using that, you can actually go in and pull just one layer out from the Amazon cloud. So you don't even have to download the file yourself. And so that's something that the project worked on a lot over the fall, just to kind of work with the people who are developing GDAL and to get all of that in there so that they're ready for the NISAR data formats. So people on the project are working really hard with the people at the Alaska Satellite Facility to try to get everything ready to where the users can actually figure out which data they want and then pull out just what they need rather than maybe downloading really large files. Okay, so a couple more examples. This is just showing a little time series of data over the San Francisco Bay Area. And what I'm showing here is on the left is just that kind of the brightness of the SAR imagery. Okay, so this is again what we call sigma naught, and this is the aggregated data. So this is a 200-meter grid, which is much coarser than the full resolution NISAR data. And what you can see if you kind of go through this is 5 dates, and the soil moisture product is on the right, kind of green in this case is wet, yellow and orange is dry. And on that date, in late November, right there, it rained. So most of the rest of the time series kind of dry. We had this one date where it rained. And if you look at the brightness image, you can see that whole image looks brighter just for that one date. One more time, bam. And so that's basically what we're seeing when we're looking at soil moisture. Another example here, this is data that isn't fully calibrated. The other stuff had gone through a higher level calibration process. But I like this too because you can still see a very high level of detail in the NISAR data, even if there might be a shift in what the data really looks like. So this is just showing on the left the input data, the brightness of the SAR imagery. On the middle column is one of the soil moisture retrievals. Again, there are 3 of them. This is just one. And on the right is what you would get from the SMAP soil moisture 9-kilometer product. It's not completely a fair comparison. There's other people who've combined SMAP with other data sets to get higher resolution products, but I do find this useful just to kind of compare these resolutions. So if we zoom in to this area right here, you can actually see in the NISAR soil moisture product, there are individual little circles here that are center pivot agricultural fields where they have, that's those little rotating sprinkler heads that go around the field. And so, you can't see this at all in the 9-kilometer product. It's really only visible when you have 200-meter resolution. And so this shows up really well in the NISAR data. We can also see the edge of kind of the desert here going into the delta where it's overall just wetter, and those center pivot fields. And I also want to point out that what's shown here is the default NISAR product. This is a 200-meter grid where we take the much higher resolution NISAR data and downsample it to that grid. But there's nothing requiring the user to do that. Any of these algorithms just want a single number, right, for every single point. You could make your own polygon that contains just your field and average just those values and make the soil moisture product yourself. That's not available yet, but that is one of the things that I'm hoping we can generate over the next few months. This is just another another example of, in this case, sentinel data. And I'm showing this to introduce you to why calibration and validation of this product is actually kind of hard. And so this is the next part of the talk. We want to take those numbers I just showed you and actually figure out, are there things in the algorithms we have to tune so that they actually match up the best with what we know the ground is actually doing. So all of these are, all of these estimates, all of these models are based on how bright the surface looks to the satellite. And while soil moisture does control that a lot, the dominant factor in many cases is just surface roughness. And so what's shown here is this area near Dijon, France, where you can actually see individual fields out here. This is the average over 5 years of data from Sentinel, and variations where you can see these edges of all of these little polygonal fields going all over the place. Those might be say a vineyard with kind of linear kind of structures with vines on them. If those are pointing kind of parallel to the direction the radar is looking versus perpendicular to the direction that the radar is looking, that's going to change the brightness a lot. The direction that the fields are plowed in, all of those will affect how rough the surface looks to the radar. And so that kind of first order thing can really, really strongly affect how bright the surface is overall at a given point. So we can still see the variation around that kind of average value, but you can't really predict that in advance. And so this is, again, just the average brightness. These areas that are kind of brighter overall out here, those are forests. This city, of course, over here, the areas that are black are water bodies. And if we look at a multi-temporal composite, like I showed earlier, this is coloring all these fields different. They're the average of spring, summer, and fall in 1 year. And all of the different colors you see here are just telling you that one of those fields is brightest in the spring, darker in the summer, things like that. So the individual fields have their own kind of average value, but the variation over the course of a year can tell us a lot. So again, our goal is to compare the NISAR soil retrievals with various types of ground truth data. How much that varies over time is going to have a lot to do with soil moisture and vegetation. So we know that. We're good at, we know we can depend on that very well. But the average value, there might be a shift of those, average brightness could have to do with all sorts of other things that we don't really have control on. So what we do about that is, instead of just looking at something like the root mean squared error, right? How close are we to the in situ data? We instead focus on something that the soil moisture community calls unbiased RMSE. And this is basically the standard deviation of the residual. So you're looking at you're basically saying that you don't necessarily have great constraints on the average value, but you can tell if a point is getting wetter or drier. Right, so that's the metric I'm going to show, and that's what we're assessing during the cal-val period. Now, to calculate the standard deviation of something, you need a whole lot of points, right? And so we need quite a few dates where we have in situ measurements and satellite-based measurements before we can tell how well we're doing and figure out which of these three models is doing best where, right? So that's why there's going to be this calibration and validation period where the group is really trying to assess these things. And so we have quite a few different types of data we're going to be using during this process. This is just showing the sparse networks. What we call those are places where there's maybe one sample in a grid cell. As we go kind of off to the right on this chart, you get more and more sites in a grid cell. And NASA has funded what we call super sites, where people will go into a field and take lots and lots of soil moisture measurements when we know the satellite is going overhead. So that's kind of the gold standard on the right, and still useful, but not as good on the left. Now, of course, for the sparse networks, where we have one station in a field, there's lots of those, right? So the benefit is you can look all over the world. There's a lot of data you can pull in, whereas we only have between 3 and 5 of these super sites. And so there's stuff in between where there's maybe a few sites in a given pixel, or where partners are, this is kind of a growing number of partners that are also trying to get data for NISAR. So each of these has different ways we can access the data. Some of them require an email from the partner site, putting the data in a file. Others are all made available online. Some of it is going to be near real time. Some of it might take several weeks for the partners to evaluate the data and send it in. So wherever we can, we're having these the groups who are collecting the data set up basically Jupyter notebooks where we can publicly share the data and make all of this available to the community. We're also going to look at other satellite products and compare with real analysis data as well. But the kind of the main level we're doing is these in situ observations. And so there's been quite a bit of effort to put this together. Pre-launch, we had not much data to work with. There's not been a whole lot of L-band data where we also had in situ observations we could compare against. There was an airborne experiment done with UAVSAR up in Canada in 2012 that had quite a bit of data acquired during that experiment. So we did try out all of these 3 algorithms on that, and they all did pretty well. And then we also, in the past few years, used ALOS-2 imagery, which is also acquired at L-band, to simulate NISAR data in a few kind of selected locations. And in those cases, we often had 40 or 50 dates at each site, so we could really do some of the statistics we need to be able to do. What's shown here on the bottom is just this unbiased RMSE metric. Again, we want to get to 6%. The colored lines here are just the 3 different algorithms, and you can see they're all well below 6%. So that's great. The problem was the black curve here shows you how much the real data was varying, and it wasn't varying much at all. This was an area in Arizona where there just wasn't a whole lot of variation in the soil moisture. So we did a good job of seeing not much changing, but that's not really a great site for actually telling which of these algorithms did better. So we hope now that we have real NISAR up there and a whole lot of data being collected on the ground, we'll be able to do this assessment better. Post-launch, I'm just going to show you some maps showing where all the data is. There's kind of, again, the sparse network sites are ones where there's only 1 station in a 200-meter grid cell. We're using all of the data we can from those sites. These are kind of globally available. A lot of them are in the US, though. The red dots here are showing soilscape, which is, there's some of those in New Zealand as well. The triangles are from NEON. And then the super sites, again, they have to have 3 or more permanent instrumented stations within a grid cell. Ideally, the partners are going out and occupying those sites during NISAR overpasses. And if NASA funded the data, the data will have to be open freely to the community at relatively low latency. Just one more plot here. This is just, again, showing some of the sparse sites. All of these kind of green, blue, red dots are places where there's soil moisture data being acquired. Some of this is in mountains where it's all rock. We don't really need to look at those sites, but all of this data we will try to bring in. The black X's here are the super sites that were initially funded, and all of the orange dots here are new partner sites that Saab Kim at JPL has worked with, put a huge amount of effort into bringing people together and convincing them to send data to JPL. And so JPL paid for some of these sensors that they're going to be using in the field. And all of that data will also be free and open. We also have partners in India who are part of the NISAR team, and this is from Dharmendra Pandey at ISRO, and they also have a large number of sites where they are acquiring in situ data at the same time. So there's going to be a whole lot of data coming in where people can look at. Sorry. And just a couple examples of some of these super sites. This is data from Yasmeet Judge at University of Florida, and I like this because you can see kind of imagery of the fields and kind of the footprint of one of these 200-meter grids. And so you can see there's some averaging that goes on in these cases. And so she's going to be taking, she's got wheat planted right now, and we'll have several other crops over the course of the first year. And again, acquiring a lot of data in the field as well about vegetation structure, health of the plants, those sorts of things. If we kind of zoom into the area in that pink box here, this is one of our first NISAR images of the area. We've got 4 so far for going ascending or traveling to the north, and 4 traveling towards the south. So we've got 8 images covering her site so far. I'm really excited to see how this eventually looks. Her site is right below this kind of little black lake in the middle there. And this is the wheat she planted She had planted by some of the students, I think, during AGU. And so it's already growing. This is from January 4th. And so we should be able to see pretty soon how well NISAR does at separating out vegetation from soil moisture. And then I just like to include this. There's lots of other partners. Cornell has a student-led group that's been trying to develop their own instruments, mostly for atmospheric science applications, but they are also going to be sharing their data with us to make this available. So here's Ithaca, Cornell's right here, and they have a few sites way out here in some agricultural fields that are owned by Cornell. Okay, so I want to end with kind of I'll try to get through this relatively quickly so we have time for questions. Coming back to how people who are interested in other types of sciences might be interested in using the soil moisture product, or at least knowing what it looks like. This is just some models from Mark Simons and Brian Reel at Caltech, where they took a whole lot of SAR data from different platforms and are looking at how the ground is deforming over time in Los Angeles. And so we want to do this in many places of the world, some of which are areas where there's also agriculture, there's also groundwater withdrawal, all of these other things that we know also affect NISAR data. This is an image showing a very well-known phenomenon that if you look at agricultural fields, this is now an interferogram, not just variations in brightness like I showed before. This is a 12-day pair from Sentinel-1 over the Imperial Valley in California, and you can see a whole lot of structure here, even just over 12 days. Out here in the desert where nothing's really going on, you don't really see anything as we'd expect. And in a plowed field, like what's shown here, you just basically get noise because everything changes when you plow a field. But all of these other little kind of brightly colored rectangles are places where you have kind of a clear signal in the phase that actually isn't ground deformation, right? This is just variations in soil moisture and vegetation that are affecting the phase, right? So if your interest is in measuring ground deformation, you need to worry about how much of this are you seeing. So why does soil moisture affect NISAR? Similar to what we showed before, you have, say, the radar data is coming and interacting with the surface, and it doesn't just reflect off the top of the surface, it also interacts with the subsurface as well. So you can kind of imagine all of these little particles in the soil are kind of acting as little antennas sending data information back to the satellite. So if it's really dry, that interaction will happen over a fairly wide depth range. If you take the same location, though, you don't move anything around, but you just change the soil moisture, you'll get a very different return. You can kind of think about it as the weight of all of these different scatterers gets pushed up closer to the surface. These surface scatterers will basically dominate the return, and the deeper ones won't be they won't be able to get out towards the surface as much. And so effectively what this means is that if you have a differing soil moisture content, you're almost looking at a different pixel, right? You have different scatterers that are contributing to the phase, and it'll add noise, but it also can add a shift in the phase, which is kind of what we're seeing, part of what we're seeing up there. And so when we think about how does this affect the phase, we want to pull out how much of this is from soil moisture, how much is from deformation, how much is from vegetation. That's the ultimate goal. And there's various levels to which we can do this. So at kind of the lowest level, we can just say how big of a problem is this? How much error are we introducing to NISAR from things like soil moisture or vegetation? And so that's probably the first thing that we as a community can do. It's not that hard compared with some of the other goals. Another approach that's done pretty widely is to try to basically throw out all the agricultural fields, trying to find the pixels that are dominated by just ground deformation rather than soil moisture and vegetation. And so the field of permanent or persistent scatters, if you've heard of that, that's really focused on this, figuring out which pixels are the ones that we as ground deformation people should be looking at. You could also do this by, rather than just trying to find points in an interferogram that are reliable, you could try to just mask out areas that are bad and focus only on the remaining parts. So this might be using models of where there's agricultural activity, other types of maps, or looking at the data itself to figure out what data you can use or not. And then finally, we can try to actually model these effects, trying to figure out how much of the phase is due to deformation, soil moisture, or vegetation, and then remove it. And so this happens at various ranges as well. There are physical models people try to put together where you actually figure out what the scattering should look like from various types of surfaces and vegetation and subsurface. This also is important for backscatter intensity. So the soil moisture models themselves sometimes use these sorts of approaches. And then other approaches basically look at the statistics of the phase. And so this can be useful in, so there's a couple ways this is useful. We often take these giant interferograms and we spatially average them to much, much smaller images just because they're too big to work with. When we do that, we get some insight into the statistics of the phase. When you've got complex value data like phase and you average it, it's not a linear observation. It's not a linear operation. And so we can use this approach to kind of pull out some interesting features in the data. One of these is coherence, and the other one is referred to as phase misclosure. And there's a whole lot of people who've worked on this. I've just listed some of them here. It's a really active and growing field in NISAR research. So just to kind of explain what that is, I think I have just enough time to do this. If you have, again, noise in the data, and this could be from gradients in the real signal, like if you're right near an earthquake, rupture, or something like that, where there's a lot of change going on in the surface. It can be these soil moisture vegetation effects. Then when you do an average of complex value data, it's nonlinear, as I said before. So if you don't have any averaging at all, and you take interferograms between 3 dates, and what's shown here is date 1 to 2, date 2 to 3, and kind of going back date 3 to date 1. If there's no averaging at all, these should add up to 0, right? That makes sense. But if you average those interferograms before doing this kind of calculation of is there a closed loop or not, then they won't necessarily add up to 0. And that comes from this nonlinearity in that averaging operation. If you unwrap the phase, now you have a real number, right? It's not a complex number anymore, and this doesn't hold. So if you work with unwrapped full resolution data, you're fine. But this is actually useful. This difference between what the two individual date 1 to date 2 and date 2 to date 3, how those compare to the date 3 to date 1 image, it tells you about the data itself. If you have Gaussian noise, things that are just kind of evenly distributed around 0, these biases should also be distributed around 0. But if you have skewed noise, which you can get from soil moisture and vegetation, then you'll get a bias. And over long time intervals, you can see that bias add up. I'm going to skip a couple slides just to make sure I finish up here. And so one of the things we do at Cornell is we look at really, really dry areas of the world, like this is out in the Atacama Desert in Chile. And we try to look at what the NISAR data looks like in these places with no vegetation, so we can understand what the effect of soil moisture alone looks like, and then try to understand later on how it looks in places where there's vegetation and soil moisture variations. And the sorts of things that I'm hoping we're going to be able to do with NISAR might look like what I'm going to show right now. So what's shown in this kind of funny triangle plot is basically a measure of how noisy the data is, something we call coherence. And this is just showing 2 years of data where you can see basically 3 different rain events. That's what's shown, kind of these colored bars here, are all time intervals where it rained at this site. So no rain at all for most of the time, then 3 times where it did rain. And each of these little squares is, again, an interferogram between 2 different dates and how noisy it is at this location. So along the diagonal, it's just date 1 to date 2, date 2 to date 3, that sort of thing. The top row is all the possible pairs relative to the first date. So in this area of the world where I'm studying here, this was out in a very, very dry place. You can make 2-year-long interferograms and they look great. But in most of the world, we only can maybe see a few pairs. So it would be like maybe the first 4 diagonals before the data would get bad. So what we're probably able to see with NISAR is things like this, where the data is really coherent for long periods of time. What's shown here is how a given pixel compares with its neighbors. And what you can see here is that each of those 3 times when it rained, you also can see a change in phase for the from that pixel compared with its neighbors. So the point of this is that when it rains, you're not just having noise be moving things all over the place. Each pixel is doing the same thing each time it rains. And I don't have time to go through all of this. Sorry, I was over ambitious, but I will end with just an overview of what we can hope to see with NISAR. Again, it's nearing public release. We'll start seeing data free and open to the public at the end of February. The soil moisture product itself is going to be a little later than that, again, because we need a little longer time to do calibration and validation, but we hope to make that available as soon as we can. The NISAR project team has been working absolutely in overtime to try to figure out how to deal with the ionosphere. All of the beautiful northern light photos you people are seeing are terrible for us, right? We're in a very active part of the sunspot cycle right now, and that is making the ionosphere worse for NISAR than it normally would be. The data is really large, and so I recommend for all of you that you kind of start looking at ways to work in the cloud if you can, or to use some of these tools that groups like the Alaska Satellite Facility are hopefully going to be able to make available to the public to subset the data so you don't have to completely blow up your home machine to work with the data. And again, vegetation and soil moisture effects do affect NISAR as well, as a very rapidly growing area with lots of exciting work getting done. And I do think there's a lot of promise about our ability to mitigate some of these phase effects that otherwise would look like ground deformation when they aren't. And so I'll end there with this pretty picture from, again, the central US. This is real NISAR data, and I'll try to get through some questions in the next few minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. This is very cool. We do have a lot of questions. So, Rowena, are you able to stay a few minutes after the top of the hour, or do you have to go?
I can stay.
Okay, so we'll roll a little bit past for other folks that can stay so we can get through a few of these. So I'll try to help you work through this. So one thing I think can follow on what you were just saying, we had a lot of questions about what's the depth resolution or the depth of penetration that you were talking about there.
Great. Yeah, that actually it varies. We often are thinking about it's about the wavelength of the SAR. So for NISAR, it's going to be the upper 20 centimeters or so, right? And if things are really dry, though, you see deeper. And if they're very, very wet, you'll see shallower, right? You'll see mostly just the surface. And so when we are looking at, say, a soil moisture measurement from a field, they're aiming for around that 20-ish centimeter depth range for NISAR. But whether it's really a true analog for what the radar is seeing, it does depend on the soil moisture itself.
Okay, and then another resolution question. So can you remind us what the general spatial resolution is? And then we have a question. It seemed like it was changing in the Sahara. So why would the spatial resolution be different?
Yes, I'm going to just pop up that horrible plot with all the things. Over here on the right, this is kind of the raw resolution that you would get from the different, kind of basically at the higher frequency you go, the smaller the pixel. Right, so 40 megahertz, which we're going to have over most of the United States, is basically a 3 by 5 meter pixel, which is pretty high resolution, and we'll be downsampling that to 200 to basically mitigate noise. In the Sahara is very, very dark because it's so dry, and so the idea is that you basically need to be using this 5 megahertz mode that they're going to be using is like a 25 meter pixel. It averages more, and so you'll have a stronger return at that level. But the 400 meter resolution of the soil moisture product is so we have more to average that darker data. The user could go in and run the same models on a higher resolution, though.
Okay, while you're here, a related question was, in one of these plots about coverage, the UK did not seem to be very shaded. So what does that mean?
I'm not sure what they mean there. I wonder if they were going to this.
The ascending and descending map, maybe?
This one? Oh, this one? Let's see. I think that's getting covered there. Yeah, I'm not sure what they mean. They might be talking about this one. Again, this is just, well, for S-band coverage, this is not whether there's any data. NISAR is getting data everywhere. This is only where we get both S and L. right? So this is only the areas where we're getting two wavelengths, and it's not happening all the time either. This is just kind of, it's harder when you do both, and it takes a lot of energy on the satellite and heats things up. So you can't do it all the time. I wish we could take both all the time, but we can't. But we will be taking L-band over all the land areas and quite a bit of the ocean as well.
Okay, let's try this one. So part of this question was about data access, and you got to that, but what about the kind of training and tutorial resources you mentioned? Maybe when might some of that be available, or like where should folks go look for that?
Yeah, there's this wonderful workshop that's been run in the kind of the early fall about how to use ICE. ICE 3 is the software that's been put together by JPL to process and Caltech to process NISAR data. And so that's going to be continuing to run, and there are recordings of that available through the Earthscope website as well. So anyone who's interested in starting to like get their feet wet in all of this, that's a great resource. It talks about SAR more generally, as well as what the processing looks like. And in terms of the soil moisture product itself, again, it's still developing a little bit. There's some changes to the code going on all the time right now as we start to see the real data. We have never had data like this before. So there are they're relatively minor changes that are going on. But all of that code is also going to be free and open so that if someone wanted to, they could load one of these lower level products and run, it's Fortran code right now, but they could run it themselves. I have been in parallel kind of developing a Jupyter version of this, and it won't be exactly what gets run by the NISAR project, but it does effectively the same thing. And so people could use that. That's probably, again, not going to be released until we're done with calibration validation, but I am hoping by sometime this summer.
Okay, two related questions maybe we'll take together. So I can't remember how much you've done with GNSS-IR with reflectometry for soil moisture, or how familiar you are with that. But so one question was, if NISAR relies on backscatter while GPS-IR uses forward scatter, how does this difference in signal geometry affect the accuracy of the moisture retrieval? And I had sort of this very similar question. To what extent can we use soil moisture estimation from GNSS-IR for calibration of NISAR?
Yes and yes, I think. It's one of the things on my list is to run, we have to kind of continue running the GNSS-IR retrieval. And I think there's a lot of promise for that, particularly in areas where we don't tend to have as many other types of soil moisture sites. So I've talked with Christine Larson about this a lot. And so it is a little bit on the back burner right now, but I definitely hope to get to that. And I think if other people are interested in doing that, there's a lot of richness in that field that could be looked at. In terms of the first question, I think that the difference is in just the footprints are pretty similar, right? If you're looking at a GNSS station, and it's going to be seen around 100 meters around it, which is approximately what we're trying to look at. But the other things that are contributing to the signal are so different that I think I would have a hard time saying what the different error structures are going to look like right now.
A few more I can lump together.
Does
soil moisture, sorry?
I said, thanks for doing this. There's a lot of questions.
Does the soil moisture estimate depend on the radar wavelength, the specific wavelength? And then in a different direction, a couple of people wanted to ask about like different soil profiles or soil types and how that affects it.
Yeah, actually, that is one of those things that keeps me up at night. Yeah, the only reason I say that is that I worked with some people who work in South America when we were looking at some of the effects of these really rare storms. And she'd actually gone to the field in this place that got, a century storm, and they were doing a lot of soil pits and trenches, and they found these like layers of caliche that were completely impermeable at a few centimeters depth. And so whatever we're averaging, it's not getting through that, right? You've got all sorts of structures that we from space have no idea about. And so if you have situations like that, the soil moisture that you're retrieving may not actually be a good estimate of 24 centimeters or whatever. excuse me. Uh, wait, I'm sorry, I went off track. The question wasn't about different wavelengths. So the different wavelengths should be sensitive to different depths, right? So that's one place where they're different. They're also going to be affected by vegetation in different ways. Theoretically, since L-band is a longer wavelength, it should be a little more robust to variations in vegetation because it's not interacting with small leaves and parts of the plant as much as, say, the shorter wavelength C-band, which is 6 centimeter wavelength, will be interacting with. And so I think for that reason alone, we have some hope that the L-band data is going to be a little more stable and not as dependent on these models of what is the vegetation doing. So for that, I think we wouldn't expect them necessarily to look exactly the same because the C-band data will have more noise. But if you did everything right and tuned the different algorithms, they should be giving you an estimate of around 6 centimeter soil moisture depth and an estimate of around 24 centimeters. So if those are the same, we would expect them to agree pretty well.
We'll try to get a couple more here because you just mentioned this. Is it possible to estimate vegetation water, VWC, content using radar observation alone, thereby reducing dependence on optical data in fusion soil moisture retrieval techniques like a SMAP-SAR combination technique?
Absolutely. And I didn't get into the details of all three algorithms, but at least one of them, it gets at this a little bit by looking at those different polarizations we can have. So not just looking at, for NISAR, we normally have the horizontal. So we're sending out horizontal polarization and we're recording the horizontal return, but we're also usually recording the vertical return as well. So the waves that go like this as they come up. And so the different in that ratio can tell you a little bit about vegetation as well. Often these are very empirical, but it is kind of an extra data set you get at the same exact time. So one of the models does have a vegetation water content model that comes out of it. And the ecosystem community for NISAR, that team, they also have kind of various aspects of vegetation that they pull out of the NISAR data as well. So they have different, they tend to be looking at areas that are much higher vegetation than we are trying to look at, but there is a lot of communication between the different groups. So to begin with, we're trying to keep things as dependent on the raw data as we can. So just how much is NISAR telling us about the soil moisture, et cetera. But as time goes on, I fully expect people to fuse more and more different data types into their own models.
We'll try for two more. See two more smaller ones here. Will this data product make the SMAP data product obsolete, or is there some sort of like how do you see that kind of sequence there?
No, I think that they're going to work really well together. Again, excuse me. There's a long history of people working with SMAP data and again doing these very, very detailed calibration validation campaigns. And for some of those applications I was describing, things like what is the flooding risk across a wide swath of landscape where you're trying to figure out, is this area so dry that kind of an incoming storm is just going to be absorbed into the earth, or is it everything saturated and that storm is going to cause flooding? SMAP's really good at that, right? That kind of larger spatial scale is works wonderfully with SMAP. And NISAR is going to tell you about details. And so if you're wanting to see what's happening in an individual catchment, an individual agricultural field, kind of looking at how what NISAR tells you about that is going to be really, really helpful. And again, NISAR is mostly telling you, is it getting wetter or drier from date to date? SMAP will bring you a little bit more of an overall view as to what that region is doing. Okay, it kind of puts it more in an absolute reference. So combining the two, I think, will definitely be useful. I know the SMAP team is actually working on a product that brings in NISAR data as well. To some degree, it's nice when groups work a little independently at this earlier stage, because then there'll be the opportunity to get together and kind of compare notes and figure out what's the best way forward. Okay, and I want to point out real quick, in the chat, Matt Pritchard put some links in there for some tutorials that are already there for how to pull in the data and stuff like that. And so for some of the people who are asking about that, I'd forgotten about those resources.
Okay, and the last one that jumps out to me here for a really specific example, it kind of gets at the possibility here. So thoughts on the resolution of this to identify, for example, seepage on embankment dams.
Yeah, there's been some really great work done with UAVSAR data on that in the Central Valley of California, where they're looking at some of the aqueduct in places where there's some spillover and seepage. I think it'll be really great for that. There'll be often those places where there's seepage, there's some vegetation change too. So you might have that question of, am I actually seeing vegetation or am I seeing the variation in soil moisture? But in reality, either of those things is bad, right? So it could be a great method for looking over the whole world at high resolution to figure out where there are potentially problems, which has been kind of, there's so many of these around the world that looking at all of them all the time has been a bit of a challenge.
Okay, with apologies to the rest of you, there are probably 20 plus questions remaining, but in the interest of time, maybe hopefully Rowena will get a lot of emails after this, but we'll
Yeah, I'm
wrap it
happy
up.
to answer things.
We'll wrap it up there for today. So thank you very much, Rowena, for presenting. It's very interesting. Thank you to everyone for joining in as well and asking questions. We hope to see you back for a future webinar. So take care.
Thank you.